Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of Rabbi Adam Kligfeld's weekly Rashi study class.
Let me read verse 8 just to give us some momentum, and then we'll maybe linger on it a little bit and then go into 9. Verse 8, right? We're still in the midst of this extended conversation between God and Moshe at the snet, the burning bush. V'haya im lo yaminu lach. God responds back to Moshe after the second of the two signs or miracles. And it will be, Moshe, im lo yaminu lach, if they do not believe you, v'lo yishma'u lakol ha'ot harishon, and they do not hearken, maybe that's the best way of translating it, to the interesting, we spend time on this, the kol, the voice, the impact of the first sign. Ve'eminu, they will indeed believe, lakol ha'ot ha'acharon, to the sound, to the voice, to the impact of the second sign. Okay? And just to paraphrase Rashi, since apparently we finished it, what we're going to hear is trying to dip into the Israelite, the Torah's our assumption of the Torah's assumption of the Israelites' knowledge of their own history, right? Which is an interesting set of layers, right? If we could reify this and imagine the actual personages of the Israelites who left Egypt, and depending on how many years and how many generations they were there, because of course there are different midrashim that lay that out, including at the Haggadah, for how long they were in Egypt. What did they know about, the story of Dinah? What did those Israelites know about Judah and Tamar? What did those Israelites know about Noah? What did those Israelites know about, the three angels or the messengers that came to Abraham and Sarah? According to this midrash that Rashi is bringing, they knew all of it. And they knew the three encounters with Abraham and Yitzchak combined with pharaohs of old and Avimelech, where they tried to take liberties with Sarai at the time and Rivka, and they were plagued. Right? They were. One of them is a direct pshat quote. One of them is a midrashic connection. They were plagued with tzara'at, and so since the Israelites know that when you mess with God's people, you get tzara, and it's not a trick, it actually happens, then Moshe, this second trick will have more of an impact on them. They should be convinced by the first one, because it's a pretty big deal to turn a staff into a snake, right? But maybe the Egyptian, Khartoumim could do that on their own. But once you bring out the second trick, they'll say, oh, this is the same God that we've been hearing about in our bedtime stories in Egypt as we've been put to bed by our parents, that this is a God who strikes the enemies of his people with Sarat, and Moshe actually went through that experience. If he's telling the truth for us, okay, I think I'll get on board. So that's the thrust of the midrash that Rashi brings on why this second sign is not just like, if someone's not going to believe the first card trick, then they're not going to believe the second card trick unless the second card trick is more powerful or more convincing. So Rashi has to explain why this is a more convincing second card trick, as it were. Okay, so that's where we left off. Any final comments on verse 8? I see Rick's hand is up. Can't hear you, Rick.
Sorry. Hi. The tricks are supposed to be for Pharaoh's benefit too, but they don't exactly work when Moses is in front of him, huh?
What do you mean? I'm not following.
He's supposed to do those tricks in front of Pharaoh, like Pharaoh would remember that it happened to Avimelech, and he would listen to Moses. So it doesn't work when he gets to the actual gig, the actual performance.
This might convince the Israelites, but Pharaoh does not remember that his predecessor was plagued by the same thing. Interesting, right? That's right, because they're in the quick retelling of the stories, and even as we try to remember the story without looking at the text, some of these steps can be forgotten, because there's the interaction between God and Moshe, the burning bush, where the tricks are explained and done. And then there's a scene where Moshe is going to do it with the Israelites to try to convince them. And then there's going to be the scene where Moshe does it in front of the Khartoumim of Egypt in their first encounter, and that's before any of the plagues actually happen. So there's several moments where Moshe is transmuting nature in God's name before we even get to the first plague. Okay, good. So let's jump into verse 9. Tova, would you like to read verse 9? You need to unmute.
Oh, yes.
I just unmuted you, so now you're good.
Thank you. Okay. Okay. V'haya im lo ya'aminu gam lishne ha'otot ha'ele v'lo yishma'un likolecha v'lakakta mimene hayaor v'shafakta hayabasha v'hayu hamayim asher tikak min hayaor v'hayu ledam bayabasha.
Good. And as Tova translates, try to pay attention, everyone, just to the kind of the structure of the sentence. And if anything, like the words are going to be mostly easily understood. See if you have any questions or just things that are piquing your interest on the way the sentence is constructed, just as a way of giving you a lead into what's going to be bothering Rashi. Go ahead.
V'haya im lo ya'aminu, and if it should be that they will not believe you,
right?
Gam lishnei haotot, even with these two signs.
Good. I think that's a good rendering of gam. Gam is usually understood when we use it as also, but here it's an even, it's an emphatic. Like right. even if the second one, that doozy of a second sign, does not convince them, then what?
Then velo yishma'un lekolecha, and they have not listened to or believed or listened to your voice. Velakaktami menu hayaor, then you should take from the water of the river, meaning the Nile, hayaor, v'shafakta hayabasha, and pour it onto the earth, onto the ground, v'hayu hamayim asher tikak hayaor, and it will be that the water that you have taken from the river, v'hayu ledam bayabashet, and it will be blood on the dry land.
Good. Very good, right? This is also, even those who know the story well just might forget that not only is Moshe's channeling God's ability to change the natural landscape part of the story before we get to the 10 plagues, there's even a presaging of the first plague, right? So, and there's a presaging of the first plague in the eyes of the Israelites, not in the eyes of the Egyptians. So the third strike, as it were, that Moshe might have to use when he's convincing the Israelites to follow him is actually a little preview of what's going to actually befall the Egyptians. And again, it's there. You could easily forget that detail as you're thinking about when does blood first appear in the Exodus story, first plague, and then obviously the 10th plague with the blood on the doorpost. It actually appears in the burning bush. Go ahead,
since I have my mic open.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting, especially after Rick's comment about impressing Pharaoh, that of the things he has done so far, this is the one that is most directly an affront or an attack on the power of Pharaoh, because one of the key attributes of the Pharaoh is he's supposed to maintain ma'at, that is the proper order, the order that came out of the chaos, and part of that order is the Nile as the heart of Egypt. And so to be taking water from the Nile and transmuting it in this way is much more directly an affront to Pharaoh.
Great, right. And this scene, right, it's mostly, first of all, it's not happening yet. God is instructing that this is what you should do if you get to strike, if you strike, the first two are strikes. It's not even in the presence of Pharaoh. It's kind of an indication to the Israelites, perhaps, that this God is able to overpower the central node of Egyptian society. Yeah, good. I saw Larry Dan's hand, then Andy, and then Joanna.
I want to talk a little bit about coal. And just as an aside, Rick and I talked about it this week's Haftarah Plethora, because the word coal appears prominently twice in Nachamu Nachamu at the beginning of two verses. Rick, I don't know if you remember which verses, 3 and 5 or something like that. One of them has a yativ on it, but there clearly it's the voice of God that Isaiah is talking about. But the reason I want to talk about it here is in verse 8, the kol is the voice of the first sign, which we talked about. But in verse 9, the kol is the voice of Moses, your voice. And I haven't had time to look up to see if any commentators had anything to say about that. Could just be the way in which the language is used, or we could take some meaning out of it. That basically, either God is saying, these will be your signs, you take ownership over all of this in some sense, or it could be he's transferring to Moshe some sort of power in the voice of the sign.
Yeah, I'm struck by that also, Larry. I'm glad you raised it. My first takeaway is that we may have no idea what the true meaning of the biblical word kol is, right? Because we're so impacted by the modern rendering of it as voice, but so many of the times that it appears in iconic scenes in the Torah, here and at Har Sinai, it's very hard to translate it as voice, right? At least the way we understand the English word voice to me, right? Because, here, lekolecha, at least Moshe has a voice, but it's not really Moshe's voice that is at play here. It's Moshe's, Moshe's presence and impact. And signs don't have voices. Like, we get what it means. We get what we're supposed to derive from the sentence, but I'm not sure if we really understand how to break down how kol is operating or how kol is operating when it comes to revelation at Mount Sinai. So I'm also struck by that, particularly the contrast in verses 8 and verses 9. Josh, do you have your hand up?
Oh yeah, just an interesting thing, because we're getting to the part where God says, or Moses is going to say, I'm not a man of words. So I don't know how that factors into that conversation on kol, but I think it's an interesting context.
Yeah, great. So there are many paradoxes about Moshe's voicelessness, because God is propping up Moshe's voice literally and figuratively here, as Moshe is protesting that he is voiceless. And of course, right, particularly as we just began the book of Devarim, right, the person who is lo ish Dvarim Anochi became ish Dvarim, like specifically, like he is the author of the book of Devarim. The man who said, I have no Devarim, wrote a book called Devarim. So both Davar and Kol play an interesting role in Moshe's trajectory. And I think it's actually okay. I'm okay with saying that I know what I'm basically supposed to get from the verse, and I know that I'm not sure exactly how kol operates. Andy?
Well, you and Josh may have stolen my thunder here, because I seized on the word kol as well, and just find, and again, I'm assuming it has something to do with words coming out of his mouth, but it just feels completely extraneous, in the sense like we've just been led all along to understand that this is all about these sort of visual miracle magic tricks that are done. And now all of a sudden it's like, no, your voice, whatever that means, matters too, but that's not anything that we've been led to believe so far. So the whole phrase just kind of jumps out.
Yeah. And if you look at the Onkelos here, all we can tell from what I'm about to show you is that Onkelos also was interested in the word kol. We don't know exactly his resolution, but he doesn't translate the word kol the same way in both verses. So if you look at Onkelos' Aramaic translation of verse 8, go back to verse 8. So Vihei imla yehemnun lach, and it is if they do not believe you. Vela yikablun, he renders yishmaun, which we, looks like it means listen, but it means to hearken, obey. He turns it into yikablun, they do not accept or receive. Lekal, kal is the Aramaic of kol. Kol, voice, kal in Aramaic is the same word. V'yemnan lekal ata. They're going to listen to the next one. So he at least renders kol as kal in Aramaic. But if you look at the next verse, V'hei im la yemnun af litrein, if they don't believe even the second one, Latrain Ataya Ha'ilin, if they do not listen to these two, Vela Yikablun, so he still translates Yishma'un as Yikablun, but if you look at it, there's no kol coming up. Vela Yikablun Minach, they don't accept it from you. So he strips the verse from the kol in verse 9. I don't know why. Is it because he's less interested in this verse and in a word-for-word translation and more in a rendering most significantly of what the verse is trying to convey, and what the verse is trying to convey is that they're not accepting you? Maybe, or maybe saying, what does kol mean, right? And if kol meant, if I could apply kol to a sign in the previous verse, well, how can a sign and a person have the same kol? So we have no proof, but we have an indication that he was trying to figure out what to do with kol. He just takes it out. Joanna.
A couple things. I wonder, I'm thinking about call more so in terms of the verb that we associate with a voice, right? So if there's a voice, then someone is speaking. And even in English, we can translate speaking not quite so literally, right? Like we often say, this speaks to me, meaning I relate to this. This has meaning for me. And so I'm wondering if call can have that more expansive meaning here of, being something that the people relate to, that they find the meaning in it. The other thing is that this verse does feel very different than the other verses that talk about the signs that Moses brings. And to steal a page from Rick's playbook, in the previous verses, the belief was, in a fairly common trope of the munach zakev katon phrase. And here it's in rather unusual trope. First of all, that pazer is unusual, and that you have two in a row. And then the other thing about this verse is that, to me, is that it seems to be a very slow reveal. It takes a lot of words to get to what's going to happen. And I think the verse, for example, could have been written much shorter. V'lakachta mi hayor, v'shafachta hayabasha, v'hayu lidam. Why do we need all those other words, right? You threw it on the yabasha and it became blood. Yeah. And there's this really slow play, slow reveal of really drawing this oath out. I don't know, for all to see, to make it play out. Why? Why do we need all those extra words?
Good. So Baruch Shekivant, right? Which is blessed be the one who anticipated. Rashi is going to raise a micro version of that question, right? He's fine with the general length of the sentence, and I'm not sure he's interpreting it the same way you are in terms of it being a slow reveal. But he does say there's some extraneous words in there. We'll get there when we get there, unless someone else wants to point out the same thing. But you're right. The whole thing could have been articulated much more compactly. Barry.
My translation has an interesting word, proof, for voice.
Huh. Which translation are you working with, Barry? Remind me.
Let's see. It's this one here. I mean, what's the name of it?
Is it Art Scroll or who's the publisher?
It's Kornfeld.
Huh. I don't know that one in particular. Does anyone else have some? Oh, the Matsuda. Got it, Matsuda. Yes, I know the Matsuda.
And so he uses it in his translation in parentheses after the word voice, proof. And so each of these, there are signs that God provides, and then God's saying then to Moshe, your voice. But the trope is different on your voice than on God's signs for kol and kolecha. But in each of these, it's a type of proof for the people to believe.
Proof is very interesting. It's a very interesting way of rendering that, because there's a relationship between proof and being convinced. It's not a great translation of kol unless we don't know what kol means, right? Unless we think we know what kol means, but we don't, right? We are influenced, sometimes properly, sometimes improperly, by by the growing momentum of how a word is generally used, that does not mean that it's accurate vis-a-vis how it once was intended, right? So maybe the modern word proof is the right rendering of kol in this setting. Everett Fox, who dances in between literal word for word and the lyrical flow of the verses, he keeps voice in both places, unlike Onkelos. If I read Everett Fox in verses 8 and 9, so it shall be, comma, if they do not trust you, comma, and do not hearken, he turns Yishma'un to hearken, to the voice of the former sign. So Everett Fox, like it sounds weird in English, but it's like, that's what it means. The voice of the former sign, that they will put their trust in the voice of the latter sign. That's a weird way of saying that they will. Verse 9, and it shall be, comma, if they do not put their trust in even these two signs. Yeah, so he turns heminu from belief into trust, and do not hearken to your voice, then take some of the water of the Nile and pour it out on the dry land, and the water that you take from the Nile will become blood on the dry land. Everett Fox's translation makes Joanna's comment even more ringing, right? He translates it with the full redundancy of the Hebrew, and you're saying to the Torah, you could have shortened it. Norm, Rachel?
With respect to kol and voice, I think that another synonym for voice here is message, that we often talk about hearing a voice, and it's hearing, paying attention to the message. It's not the nature of the sound, it's the message. But the other thing is about the verbosity of this sentence. I think that where the Torah so often seems to specialize in ambiguity, in this sentence they wanted to be very clear that Moshe takes the water out, it's still water. It's in his hand or in a ladle or whatever it's in, it's still water. He pours it on the ground, and that's when it becomes blood.
Oh, good. So that's another Baruch Shekivanta. You're going to have a surge of adrenaline when we read Rashi, Norman, because you're going to realize that you actually are a early Middle Ages Torah commentator and you didn't know it. Wonderful.
French.
Rick.
Hi. So thank you to Joanna for starting a trope talk, but I did want to say this is the first time that you have two pazers in a row in the book. And the only other, I'm going to check, but the only other time that's coming up is the Ten Commandments. It doesn't have to do with Egypt. It's about the Tmuna and Mima'al from above. So, but I just thought I'd bring that up. For some reason, whoever put the words to music wanted to stress these two words. And if I could do one.
What did you say? Whoever put it to music?
Yeah.
the Holy One, blessed be she. I don't know where you're going with that, Rick.
Okay. And then just one more thing. The next time we have a pazer is on Vayishma'u in verse 31. So, and they believed. So Moses is worried all the time that they're not going to believe. Sorry to read ahead, but I had to look for the next pazer, and it's on Vayishma'u in verse 31.
Great. The musical through lines are really powerful, right? We'll they're Rorschach tests, right? We'll never know, what they were intended for, if they were intended for anything, whether they were added in by the Holy One or by some Judean sitting on a hill. But they're wonderful. They're in Midrash. There's a concept called the Gzeira Shava, where two psukim, entirely different contexts in the Torah that share the same word, sometimes a small word like gam, are woven together to suggest that what is true about this verse is true about that verse in law. And law is determined that way, right? Law is not determined by the same comparison when it comes to trope, but meaning can be derived with that kind of a comparison. And it's really rich stuff. Thank you. Larry, Diane, and Barry, and then we'll look at the Rashi.
I just wanted to give you the translations. Alter is true to the literal current understanding of kol being voice in both verses, somewhat surprisingly, but Aryeh Kaplan is not. And I'll just go
also
back.
Not surprising.
Right. Also not surprising. I'll just go back to the verse 8 for a second. There he says, And if they do not believe you and they do not pay attention to the first miraculous sign, then they will believe the evidence of the second sign. And then in verse 9, and if they do not believe these two signs and still do not take you seriously. So, no comment. I think you all understand.
Yeah, I mean, I really would like to. I'd love to meet Aryeh Kaplan because I enjoy his translations, and I enjoy the weaving together of like a good English, like a biblical style English, and then American colloquialisms, right? If they don't take you seriously, but the evidence is similar to Barry's translation of proof, right? Saying whatever we think the word kol means, to render it as voice, Everett Fox. It might seem to you accurate because that's what you think the verse should be translated as. That's not what it means here. It's not a voice.
Sadly, as you probably know, he's gone.
I think if I knew that, I'd forgotten that.
A long time ago, but some people may not know, in addition to being a scholar and an author of many, many books, interesting books, he was a physicist, grounded in physical science. And like Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, Zichrono Levacha, someone who emphasized the differences between science and faith, and both can coexist at the same time.
Wow. I know very little about him, but now I'm going to go try to learn about him. I did not. I've come across his works here and there. I think the most exposure of how to Aryeh Kaplan is through your bringing his translation to this class. So now I'm going to go learn more about him. Thank you for that.
He died very young. I think he was 47.
Wow. That's, given how old I am, that's very chilling. Barry.
So I'm concerned soon God comes down on Moshe for Moshe's not believing the people that he's going to lead. And yet here, God is a partner in Moshe in anticipating that the people will not believe.
Say that one more time.
It seems unfair that God soon is going to come down on Moshe for Moshe's not believing in the people. Whereas here, God is a partner with Moshe in that anticipating that the people will not believe.
Got it. And that God does not come down on the people for not believing? Is that what you're saying?
I'm not going that far.
Right.
Just that it seems, why come down only on Moshe? When here, God is partnering with Moshe in the possibility of not believing.
Yeah. That leads me to a somewhat tangential story on the expectations and the burdens on leaders, right? Like Moshe is going to be expected, different things going to be expected of Moshe than of the people. I remember at some point early on in my career in my former congregation, I don't remember if it was year 2 or year 3, all of a sudden the burdens of what it meant not just to get up and give a sermon, but to lead, to make hard decisions, to make hard calls, to lead the community, to kind of hold everything together was really weighing on me.
My darash this last Shabbat was on leadership. And
Yes.
Thank you for your comments, by the way, to me, that made it more poignant in what happens to Moshe.
I went and had dinner with one of my mentors from rabbinical school, Rabbi Bill Lebo, who to this day still is to be one of my most beloved teachers. This may be a story that Josh has heard in some of our conversations that I remember. And basically I took him out to dinner and I kvetched, all the things that were expected of me and the high standards and the incessant pressures. And, even in a small congregation upstate New York, it was a lot for me. And Rabbi Lebo, who served 2 communities in an exemplary fashion before he became the dean of the rabbinical school, he said to me in very Leboian fashion, and this is a very East Coast kind of a comment, he said, Adam, you could have been a toll collector on the Tappan Zee Bridge, right? I said, yes. He said, if you'd been a toll collector on the Tappan Zee Bridge, you wouldn't have these pressures, right? I said, right. He says, you chose to be a leader, right? I said, right. He goes, okay. That's where he stopped, right? It was a really wonderful lesson, right? If you choose something that's going to draw a lot upon you, then when it draws a lot upon you, of course, right? And there are ways to to live life in different ways, and there's no harm, no foul, right? They say you chose leadership. Okay, this is leadership, right? So Moshe does not want the leadership, right? But God sees in Moshe leadership capability, and since God sees in Moshe leadership capability, he's going to hold him to a very high standard, including, this notion of his own belief in his own people, right? And it's hard to be a leader, and also very ennobling. Okay, wonderful. Let's go back to Tov. Oh, we almost got to the Rashi. Renee, almost there.
Since you were doing a couple translations before, I wanted to tell you that in the Saperstein has the voice, and then it becomes your voice.
Anyone have JPS, the Eitz Chaim in front of them? I don't have it in front of me. I can go get it quickly. I like to see how JPS does it. If not, I'll go get it. Hold on. Okay.
JPS is also Sefaria. Sefaria uses JPS for that.
Right. I remembered that, but it was quicker for me to get to my shelf. So here's how JPS translates it. And if they do not believe you, he'eminu, or pay heed, that's the Yishma'u, to the first sign, just elides the word kol. They will, basically, he turns he'eminu lakol into believe you or pay heed. It's really an interesting elision. They will believe the second. And if they are not convinced, this is almost Aryeh Kaplanish, if they're not convinced by both these signs and still do not heed you, again, no kol, take some water from the Nile and pour it on the dry ground, and interesting, the translation here is going to get to some of Joanna's concerns. Then there's a hyphen, the water that you take from the Nile, and hyphen, will turn to blood on the dry ground. So JPS is sensitive to the redundancy and almost makes it somewhat less redundant by adding it in as a parenthetical clause, right? Then it just makes it clunky as opposed to redundant. But no kol. So JPS just avoids the question by basically turning it into a phrase, right? And an idiomatic phrase is not translated phrase by word. So if it's an idiomatic phrase, then we don't have to deal with what the word kol means. Okay. Tova, let's read Rashi on verse 9. Oh, and depending on which version of Rashi you have, the Rashi in the Torah Chaim that most of us have does not have a portion of a Rashi comment that appears in many others, and it's attributed to Rashi HaYashan. We don't know exactly what that is. It's probably not original, but if you don't have that volume, Tova, I'll read that comment. Do you have, what's the first word of the Rashi commentary that you have? You're muted.
V'hayu bet pe'amim.
Okay, that's probably where Rashi began his comment on the verse. But since I've got several Rashi commentaries in front of me, one of them includes this precursor comment that I'm going to read. For some of you may have it. I'll read it slow. I wonder if it appears on Sefaria that I could actually go through it with you. I didn't check that. I don't know which version Sefaria has. 1 second. We're Shemot 4:9, right?
It has the Vilakachat.
Okay, so let me pull that up and then we can go through it together. And we've spent some time before, so we're not going to spend time now on the provenance of these other comments of Rashi. But just suffice it to say that sometimes there are phrases attributed to Rashi that we do not know if he wrote, and not all versions of Rashi included. Okay, just finally pulled it up. Okay. So, okay. So velakachta mimeimei hayor, and you shall take from the waters of the Nile. Mimeimei is an interesting word, right? Just because, just throw a bunch of mems and yuds together and you get a word out of it. From the waters of. Ramaz lehem shebimaka rishona nifra me elahutam. He hinted at them, here it's translated as alluded, that in the first plague that's to come in the future, he will extract payment. Nifra is to punish or to extract payment from their gods, commentary, And what's interesting about, by the way, this Rashi, which does not appear in the Torah Chaim, in the other versions, in the versions of Rashi where it appears, it's only this phrase that's now in parentheses that's attributed to Barashi Yashan, to suggest that some editors believe that the first line of this Rashi actually is Rashi, but in our version, in the Torah Chaim, which is a very highly scholarly work that uses several different manuscripts, none of it appears. So that's just an interesting thing in terms of the history of how the text came together. Perush, meaning, Kadosh Baruch Hu, when the Holy One, blessed be God, Nifra min ha'umot, when he extracts from punishment from the nations, Nifra me'elahu tam tchila, first God takes from their gods, like strikes or exact payment upon their gods. Shahayu ovdim lenilus hamechayotam. For, as Tova was telling us before, the Egyptians actually worshipped the Nile, and it was the main thing that their leaders were meant to control. Hamechayotam, which gives them life. V'hafcham ladam, and therefore turned it into blood. The Rashi Yashan in ancient Rashi. So what this comment is adding, perhaps, is linking this scene even more closely to the 10 plagues, and also creating this klal, as it were, that when God is going to strike a foreign nation, the first thing that God strikes is the supposed gods of that foreign nation. Right? And if you ever wonder why in the order of the plagues, why doesn't locust come first? Why doesn't darkness come first? Right? It's both the case that water is the source of life, and so if you play with as we in the Southwest know all too well, if you mess with a population's water source, you're in trouble. But it's not just the fact that it's the population's water source; it is their God, according to them. And so God first strikes the God, indicating to the people that they're going to be next. Whether Rashi said any of this, we don't know, but I wanted to read it to you because it's in some of the commentaries. Okay, Joel.
Okay, my first question is, who's the they? Because I thought we're talking about the elders, and now all of a sudden he seems to be switching to the Mitzrim.
Which they are you responding to?
If they don't believe you, if they don't heed your voice.
Yeah.
Aren't we talking about, if the elders don't?
Yeah.
Okay, well,
keep going.
Each of these signs appears to have a dual meaning. One, it's speaking to the Israelites, and it's also speaking to the Mitzrim. So on the Egyptian side, Rashi's saying, okay, it's speaking because that's their God, so it has special significance to them. But I don't know if that same significance has to the Israelites.
Right. I think that's why this Rashi, or this attributed to Rashi, uses the word Ramaz. The Egyptians aren't in this proposed scene, but God, Rashi is saying that God is saying that Moshe, when he comes to the third sign, is both trying to convince the Israelites and also winking at them. By the way, when this actually happens in real time, this is the first thing I'm going to do to their gods. Not that the Egyptians will be aware of it in the moment, but that it's a hint towards what the Israelites are going to experience in the 10 plague moment. But I think you're right that the only people in the scene, it's just a proposed scene, it's an anticipated scene, are Moshe and the leaders of the Israelites.
Can I propose a different meaning?
Absolutely.
If you think of the Exodus as being like a rebirth, right? Going through the Red Sea as, the birth canal. This is saying the blood has a different significance besides death. It's also, the menstrual fluids. This is like, this is showing that you're still fertile. You're still a fertile people. You still have the ability to be born.
There's a whole lot to go on there, Joel. There's a lot written about the very graphic life and death and birth canal imagery of the Israelites' extraction from Egypt, right? And yes, very much so. The way the Nile, the way the Sea of Reed splits, and the Israelites emerging on the other side, right? The whole ritual of mikveh is based on the notion of bursting through water, as we all did when we were born, to take a breath as a new person. You're adding in that even the blood may be evocative of that, particularly as Vayikra is going to focus on blood as both blood as the result of the death of an ovum, which therefore is one more opportunity for life not to come into being, as the paragon of anti-life, right? And therefore, you're reading it as fertility, right? Vayikra, according to most commentators, is going to read it as the presence of the blood suggests a monthly death, right? Which is why the tradition is so reactive to it. So there's a lot there, and we could probably come back to it many different times. So I appreciate your picking up on that. Barry, and then we'll finish, and then we'll actually read the Rashi that's in front of Tova. But after Barry, before Tova, I just want to make a calendar announcement. Go ahead, Barry.
Yeah, I just want to underline what Joel prefaced with. It's in 13:16. Lech v'asafta et ziknei Yisrael.
Yes.
From then, everything from then on, that's the subject. That's the object of what's going on here.
Correct. Okay, before we go back to Tova, just in case anyone has to leave early, I'll send the email out again. Like sort of some sad calendar news. This is going to be my last class teaching in quite some time. I leave on vacation on Monday. I'll be in the East Coast for a few weeks. And by the time I come back, we're in Elul. And I always reduce my teaching load in Elul as I get ready for the high holidays. So that's normal. What's less normal in terms of this class is my timing my vacation just before Elul. It just doesn't happen that way, but it is this summer. So as much as this class fills me with nourishment every single week, this is a pullback first vacation and then pre-high holidays. So we normally return after that. The first time we usually study after that is the Wednesday of Sukkot. I just want to see what day of the week Yontif are on. And I know that Sukkot seems very far away. It's not that far away. So this year...
Tuesday and Wednesday.
Yeah, so Yontif is on Wednesday. So I'm theoretically open to moving our class, just because it's been so long, to the Thursday of the first day of Chol Hamoed Sukkot. So I'll put this all on email. You don't have to respond right now. It's not an official way of doing it. But if a minion of you, if a cohort of you can, on the 23rd of September and the 30th of September, move from a Wednesday to a Thursday, then we can start earlier than we otherwise would have. Leonard is not on the class today. In the email, I'll invite him to say whether he's present to teach in any of those slots. And I'll miss this weekly rhythm, but I'm looking forward to spending time with my family on the East Coast, and then looking forward to helping prepare the community for Yamim Noraim. And I apologize. I really do apologize in advance for how long this gap's going to be. But the good thing about a class that goes on for years and years and years, that when we resume, and then it keeps going with great intensity. Renee, can't hear you. No.
That time slot is when Rabbi Schatz does Midrash.
Oops, sorry, I muted you by accident. Go ahead.
I said that time slot is when Rabbi Schatz does Midrashah.
Thursdays at 8:30.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, can you do it on Friday mornings?
I'll look at my calendar, and you'll see updated information on the email. Okay. All right, Tova. Now let's go to the Rashi that everyone has, which is going to finally get back to what a version of what Joanna anticipated, which is the redundancy in the second half of this verse. Rashi's focus is on a very specific redundancy, and what he derives from it is rather expansive and interesting. Tova, unmute.
Okay. Vehayu bet pe'amim. So hayu is used twice.
Right. Let's just look at that. Right. So,
right.
In the redundancy that Joanna pointed out, there's a very specific redundancy that the word vahayu appears twice and doesn't need to be. Right. And if we just work in the Hebrew, take the water from the Nile, throw it onto the ground, and then in the second half of the phrase you have two v'hayus, and it will be that the water that you took from the Nile, they will be blood on the ground. So if there's anything that's uniquely redundant in this verse, it's the double v'hayus. It could have been, and it will be v'hayu hamayim asher tikach minei or, the water that you take from the Nile, ledam bayabashet, will become blood on the ground, right? So yes, it could have been shorter than that, but it certainly could have been that short. So Rashi is saying, what are these two v'hayus?
Okay, so nira be'nei ilu de'amar v'hayu hamayim asher tikach min hayaor ledam bayabashet. It appears to me that it could have been said, and it will be that the water that you take from the river will be blood on the ground.
Right, and to better set up kind of the thrust of the sentence, we might want to translate either as had it been said. It appears to me.
Oh, had it been said. Had it been said.
Right, kind of a pluperfect, yeah.
Shomea ani, then I would understand shebeyado heim nekpachim ladam, that it was from that it had. It's okay. That in his it would have been blood in his hand and therefore blood on the ground as it was in his hand.
Right, and that I Rashi might understand from that as soon as he took the water from the Yaor and put it in his hand, that's where the magic trick happened. That's where the bunny came out of the hat. That's when it turned to blood. And then the throwing it on the ground is just throwing the bloody water on the ground. Why is that significant? We'll see in a second. Uma? Yeah.
Okay. And so then, let's see. Ve'af kesha. My text is hard to read. Ve'af kesha yardu la'aretz yiyu ba'ahaviyatan. Aval avshan belam.
Translate before the aval.
Oh, okay. Ve'af. Let's see. But as the text stands, ve'af keshayar du, as it stands, la'aretz yiyu. Okay, I'm not understanding this part well.
This is actually very hard.
Yeah.
Rashi language. Af. So he's completing the thought that had it only been one hayu, I would have thought that the water would have been turned to blood in his hand, and then af ksheyardula arts, when the waters would descend yarad to the ground, yihiyu, they would be. If you kind of know rabbinic and Talmudic language, this phrase makes sense. If you don't, it's hard to make sense of. Yihiyu b'havyatan, they would be as they are, which is kind of rabbinic Hebrew way of saying they would stay. So I would understand it to be, and we had just said this out loud before, that they turned to blood in your hand, and when they got to the ground, they stayed as bloody. Yihiyu b'havyatan, they would be as they are. Aval akshav. Milamdenu shelo yiyudam ad sheyiyu bayabasha. However, now we learn that that it was blood, and that it did not become blood until it touched the earth, until it was on the earth. Right. So there's several steps here. First step, Rashi is saying two v'hayus. Second step is saying without the first hayu, and we could argue this note, it would seem to be as if the water had turned to blood as soon as it got into his hands. And now he's arguing that with the second hayu, it's to suggest that the miracle doesn't happen until there's a second hayu. And it will be that, remember that water, which was still water that you took from the Yaor, v'hayu, they will be blood bayabashet, when it gets to the ground. Okay. So let's say all of his steps are correct, right? The meta question is, so what? Right? We also have to answer to what might be going on in Rashi's mind. Why is that significant? Why is it significant in this sign that the blood does not become blood? The water does not become blood until it gets to the ground. So that's even assuming we buy Rashi's surgery on the verse. So I want to hear comments both on the surgery itself on the verse, and I also want to hear comments on the so what. I'll read you a super commentary on that in a little bit. The other thing I want to pay attention to, and we may not have a chance to get to all of it today, is this is a weird way that Rashi constructs a Rashi, because Rashi says the words nireh be'enai. It appears to me, shomei ani. I understand that. Every Rashi commentary is that, but it doesn't say that often. Like it's an interesting window. It's just that Rashi is musing about this, and the recorder was on. It seems to me. Let's see, how should I think about this? If it was written that way, I would have understood this. Well, clearly some version of that process is happening for Rashi on every verse. But here he's giving us a window into his thinking, but he doesn't give us a window into the thinking about why this comment is even significant. That's left for us. So you maybe get this every 150 comments of Rashi, and I wanted to point it out. Okay, a lot of hands up. Let's start just because we haven't heard from Ilan today. I know you were the last hand up, but Ilan, what do you got to say about this?
I just want to talk about what you just said, which is when people say, it seems to me, as opposed to saying the grass is green. If I said, well, it seems to me the grass is green, that's a little bit of a hedge, right? So I read that as him being less sure of his interpretation here than he is in other places.
Nice. It's a more subtle way of giving it than just announcing something dispositively. Good. Joanna?
So, and anticipating a little bit that, we have the Khartoumim coming up who can do tricks also. Is it a trick or is it God's action? If it happens in Moses's hand, maybe he had red food coloring up his sleeve and did a sleight of hand, and it wasn't really, a sign from God. If the transformation happens on the ground where, the people see clear first and then red, it reflects more clearly that this is a sign from God and not some fancy trick comparable to what the Khartoumim might be able to do.
Good. It's your second Baruch Shekivant of the class. For those of us who have the Torah Chaim commentary, do you have that one, Joanna? Are you working off of this one? Let me read it. Look at footnote 9. So from this book, footnote 9 on that commentary, Ula Hagdil Amar Kain. Why does Rashi make this comment? To increase the impact of this miracle. She'im hayula dam ba'odo biado. If it had turned to blood while it was still in his hand, makom lachartumim, there would have been place for the Egyptian magicians, because this scene is, even though it's not directly linked to, it's like anticipating the version of the scene that's going to happen with them. They would have had place, Lomar, to say, Sevadama yabedo, he's got red paint in his hand. Lachain siva sheishboch le'enehem, therefore God commanded that he should throw it in front of their eyes, et hamayim, the water, al haaretz, onto the ground, be'odam mayin, while it's still water, ve'achar kach sheyagiu la'aretz, but once it hits the ground, where there could be no red dye hanging out there, yithafchu ladam, it will become blood. That's the super commentary of the Levush, one of the super commentaries on Rashi. That's one way of explaining why Rashi is going through this whole process. Barry and then Larry, Diane?
In my Matsuda version, there's a footnote that has an interesting twist on this. I'll just read it. The significance of this is Moshe, owing a debt of gratitude to the river, which had saved him as an infant, could not be the one to cause the water to turn to blood.
So it has to be the ground that turned it to blood, not Moshe. Yeah.
Therefore, the water turned into blood only after having left his hand.
Great. That idea is going to come back, Barry, when we actually get to the first plague, because the Midrash is very sensitive to the fact that Moshe is the initiator of all the plagues, but Moshe is told for Aaron to actually initiate the plague of blood, because how could Moshe strike the Nile that saved him? It's a beautiful Midrash that has lots of ramifications in terms of, our, how we treat those who sustain us. Larry, Diane?
I was just going to go along the lines of what you said. My super commentary goes on and says, and God learned from this that even still the Egyptians would think it was a trick, and therefore had Aaron be the one to pass his staff over the waters to cause it to happen.
Got it. Good. Barbara?
Yeah, in my translation, it almost sounds like there's angels or something coming down to earth to do this, because it says, I would understand that in his hand they turned to blood. And also when they descended to the earth, they will be as they were. Who descended to earth?
Water, because water in Hebrew is plural. That's why. Water is a plural noun in Hebrew, mayim. So literally, this sentence is written in plural. Yihiyu, they will be, b'havyatan, as they are, but the they is the word mayim, which is plural. But it's just the way the Hebrew language considers, basically the Hebrew language considers water to be waters, essentially.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome. Stevie, perhaps last comment of the day? We don't hear you yet, Stevie. I see you're unmuted, but we don't hear you.
All right. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay. It seems to me that when he says Nirali, that he's sort of admitting that he's not quoting from any midrash, that he's just sort of, scraping his own head. And it also seems to me that this comment is sort of awkwardly incomplete, or sort of not in the style of a Talmudic comment, in that he only explains one of the, half of the nafkamina, that if there was both, if there was one vahayu at the beginning, we know what that would mean. But he doesn't address the question of what if the text said v'hamayim asher tikach min hayor v'hayu l'adam b'yabashet, which, and in the Talmud, this happens all the time where they say there's, why do we need both of these things? And then they examine both possibilities. And
Stevie, define nafkamina for everyone.
The implication of this, hypothetical other text.
Literally means that which comes out from it. Nafka mina, coming out from it. But the implications of a midrash. Did everyone see what Stevie did there? He made a commentary on Rashi's use of the word "it seems to me" by saying "it seems to me." That was beautiful, because you said "it seems to me" that when Rashi says "it seems to me," it means that he was not relying on any particular midrash. So it seems to me that you were hedging your bets. You don't even really believe what you were saying, because you said "it seems to me." Yes, that's an interesting one, and there are super commentaries on Rashi, but what you don't have. What you don't have is a marei makom, like a hyperlink to a midrashic source from which Rashi gets this comment. So maybe this is indeed. I don't think that happens every time. I don't think that every time Rashi is not drawing from a midrash, he adds in a nireh b'einai. But this might be a situation where he's not drawing on a midrashic source and he does add nireh b'einai.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.